Her torn diary page, smeared with seawater and sweat, was pulled from the pocket of a Japanese aviator, recovered near Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The entry was dated only 3 days before his death. It spoke of ghost eyes that pierced the ocean even at night, a reference to something the young pilot could not understand. His squadron had slipped under cloud cover, expecting surprise. Instead, the American carriers launched interceptors directly into their path. How he wondered in frantic script, had the enemy known the exact approach before a single engine sound reached them? The question was not rhetorical. For the Imperial Navy, surprise had once been its most lethal weapon. Pearl Harbor had taught the world what well-planned concealment could achieve. But 2 years later, the tables had turned. On scattered islands and across vast seas, Japanese flyers found themselves ambushed, tracked and herded into battles they did not intend. The change had little to do with luck, and everything to do with glowing screens hidden deep inside American ships. In one carrier after-action log, dated 25 October 1944, a radar officer scribbled a brief line: 20 inbound, bearing 130 degrees, altitude 8,000 feet, ready to intercept. That simple sentence held more meaning than the aviators above ever guessed. It showed that their once invisible approaches were now mapped like ink trails across a glowing oscilloscope. The operator's hands trembled, not from fear but from awe at the technology's precision. Within 7 minutes, Hellcats were climbing into position, and the incoming formation never stood a chance. Archival reports noted that by late 1944, the U.S. Navy fielded more than 1,200 radar units across carriers, battleships and picket destroyers. The Japanese had radar sets too, but scattered intelligence reports suggested only 200 of them, many unreliable, often left idle to conserve fragile components. Numbers alone did not tell the story. What mattered was integration. The Americans had woven radar into command and response, feeding pilots precise vectors in real time. Pilots trained for years in gunnery suddenly faced opponents, guided by unseen eyes. Photographs from the period show a darkened room below decks. Sailors hunched over circular screens, glowing like moons in blackness. Cigarette smoke curled above them. Every sweep of the beam carried new possibilities, a faint return here, a cluster there. To those who had lived by charts and compasses, it felt like sorcery. One petty officer later described it in testimony as watching the sea become transparent. That was the nightmare that Japanese flyers were recording in their final letters. The irony was that Japan's leadership had been warned. Reports filtered back from New Guinea in 1943 of aircraft intercepted under cloud cover. Field commanders suspected some new American listening gear. Yet the Imperial High Command dismissed the accounts as excuses for failure. Radar, in their view, was too fragile for the humid tropics, too complex for mass issue. This miscalculation sealed the fate of thousands. When the suicide missions began in late 1944, young volunteers were promised clear skies and undefended ships. Instead, they flew into invisible nets. Numbers from quartermaster tallies sharpened the picture. On 25 October alone, Task Force 38 recorded 527 enemy planes destroyed. More than half were intercepted before reaching gunnery range. Radar had made the difference. Japanese pilots wrote of bullets in the dark and fighters from nowhere. Their confusion mirrored what American sailors experienced as relief. A chaplain aboard USS Essex wrote in his diary that evening, "We buried 12 today, but it could have been hundreds. The screen saved them." Picture the tableau. On the flight deck, men in oil-stained gear hauled wreckage clear after yet another kamikaze attempt. Down below, in the radar room, a young seaman kept calling out bearings in steady cadence. Sweat dripped onto his logbook. He knew lives depended on each word. The contrast was stark. Above, chaos and fire. Below, quiet voices in dim light guiding unseen hunters. By late November 1944, American intelligence had intercepted Japanese orders assigning entire wings to suicide duty. The documents promised honor, yet between the lines one could sense desperation. For every pilot trained, the U.S. factories produced 2 radar sets and 3 replacement fighters. The imbalance was unbearable. Captured letters reveal the growing despair. We are sent like moths, but the sky itself betrays us. Even in coded optimism, resignation bled through. Still, there were moments of bravery. Survivors recalled kamikazes pushing through heavy fire, wings aflame, determined to strike. Some did, but their commanders noticed the cost. Logs from Vice Admiral Ugaki's headquarters noted that of 83 planes dispatched on one sortie, only 14 found targets. The rest vanished, many shot down long before the ocean's spray was visible. To American radar operators, those dots were just blips erased from the screen. To Japan, they were irreplaceable suns. The sensory shock of radar cannot be overstated. It was not just seeing the enemy earlier. It was predicting, calculating, anticipating. In training films shown to US crews, instructors emphasized that radar gave 5 extra minutes to think. In war, 5 minutes meant survival. It meant adjusting intercepts, fueling fighters, bracing gunners. Japanese planners never accounted for those invisible minutes. Their strategies, built on sudden dives and surprise torpedoes, collapsed under the weight of early warning. Every 250 words, the tension deepened. First, the diary fragments, then the after-action log, next, the intercepted orders. Each revealed the same truth. The kamikaze wave was flying blind into a storm they could not perceive. The enemy knew where they were before they had even formed attack lines. The effect was demoralizing. One pilot, captured after ditching at sea, reportedly asked his interrogator, "Do you see us in the clouds?" His disbelief captured the essence of the shift. By early 1945, American carriers operated like floating fortresses of detection. Destroyers extended radar picket lines miles ahead, creating overlapping fields. Numbers again tell the story. A single picket destroyer could detect incoming planes at 80 miles, giving interceptors up to 15 minutes warning. Multiply that by dozens of ships, and the Pacific had become a vast web. The Japanese flyers, guided only by compasses and fading sunlight, were trapped. Yet behind the statistics were ordinary men. Radar operators missed meals, sat for endless shifts, and strained eyes against the green glow. One sailor remembered falling asleep at his post, jerking awake as the sweep passed. "I dreamed the dots kept coming," he said years later. That human cost, monotony, pressure, fatigue, rarely appears in tallies. But it mattered, because each alert saved lives on deck. As 1945 dawned, the diary fragments grew more frantic. Kamikaze volunteers wrote farewell notes, not only to families but to the sky itself. "The Americans are waiting already when we arrive," one wrote in February. "I do not think they guess at our hearts." The tragedy was double-edged, courage met by cold calculation. In the silence of radar rooms, operators read coordinates, not emotions. War demanded detachment, even as letters revealed the human toll. And so, in the darkness of the Pacific, young men launched into missions promised as decisive. Instead, they met glowing screens, calm voices, and interceptors climbing on command. Radar had rewritten the balance. Yet the full scale of this transformation, how factories, technicians, and industry made those screens multiply, remains to be seen. That story would unfold not in battle logs, but in the roar of assembly lines thousands of miles away. In a January 1945 report circulated through the War Production Board, one line carried both pride and menace. By year's end, 45,000 radar units produced and delivered. The figure stunned even veteran logisticians. Radar was once an experimental curiosity. Now it was a commodity of war, rolling off American assembly lines with the same rhythm as rifles and rations. For Japanese planners hoping to overwhelm the Pacific with courage alone, this number was a death sentence. Technology was no longer rare. It was abundant, and abundance itself was a weapon. The heart of that transformation lay in anonymous brick buildings scattered across the United States. Factories in New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Illinois, once known for producing radios or refrigerators, retooled their floors to churn out cathode ray tubes, oscillators, and magnetrons. In Cambridge, MIT's radiation laboratory recorded output of more than 2,000 radar sets in a single quarter. Quartermaster tallies noted shipments leaving by rail in sealed crates, marked only sensitive electronic gear. Each crate carried the potential to save a destroyer crew from sudden ruin. The scale defied imagination. A typical SCR-270 unit required more than 6,000 individual parts. American industry learned to treat that complexity not as a bottleneck but as a challenge. Conveyor belts hummed, and inspectors checked each component with micrometers. Workers, many of them women who had never seen the sea, knew that a miswired circuit could cost hundreds of lives. Letters from one Chicago assembler reveal the quiet pride behind the labor. "We cannot fight with rifles, but every tube we solder may see farther than 1,000 eyes." Step inside one of those workshops in winter 1944, and the sensory details overwhelm. The smell of solder and insulation drifted through the air. Fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of benches where technicians in rolled-up sleeves bent over glowing glass tubes. Outside, freight cars rattled across snow-dusted rails, carrying finished sets to ports. The image could be mistaken for a civilian electronics boom. Only the urgency in every movement betrayed the reality. This was war by production. Numbers told commanders that industry was keeping pace. By mid-1944, the Navy Bureau of Ordnance reported that every fleet carrier carried at least 5 radar arrays, with destroyers mounting 2 or 3 each. Destroyer escorts, often overlooked, multiplied so quickly that by spring 1945, more than 500 radar-equipped hulls patrolled the Pacific. Japanese pilots who once counted on gaps in coverage now found no such blind spots. Steel and circuitry, multiplied thousands of times, had sealed them off. But production alone could not explain the shock experienced by enemy airmen. What mattered was the marriage of machines and training. American schools at Treasure Island and Camp Davis processed more than 20,000 radar technicians by 1945. Students learned not only to read faint echoes, but to translate them into vectors for pilots within seconds. A log from one training class recorded drills where recruits had just 30 seconds to identify altitude and heading. Speed was discipline. Discipline was survival. The Japanese, who fielded only a few hundred trained operators, never matched the scale. The human element extended to the home front. In Milwaukee, mothers who worked day shift soldering coils would come home to write letters to sons flying over the Pacific. One noted, "I imagine him shielded by the screen I helped assemble." This fusion of personal hope and industrial precision gave the war effort its moral backbone. For every kamikaze that fell into the sea, there was a worker who had tightened a bolt, tested a dial, or wired a circuit with quiet determination. Archival photographs capture a stark tableau, a vast hall with hundreds of women in overalls hunched over benches, each with a small lamp illuminating fragile tubes. A supervisor stands watch with a clipboard. The grain of the photograph shows fatigue on their faces, but also resolve. Contrast it with images from Japanese workshops, where limited resources meant hand-built sets, often plagued by shortages of copper and quartz. Abundance against scarcity. This was the silent battle that defined the skies. The cost figures alone reveal the imbalance. U.S. radar production in 1944 consumed roughly $1.5 billion, while Japanese estimates show only $50 million equivalent allocated to electronic detection. Even when Japanese engineers produced effective sets, shipping lanes choked by submarine attacks meant components never arrived in time. Meanwhile, American Liberty ships delivered crates of radar parts alongside food and ammunition, ensuring fleets never lacked spares. Technology was not only advanced, it was available, dependable, and replaceable. The sensory shock extended to the front lines. Pilots returning from missions described controllers calmly guiding them back through storm and darkness. "Turn 3 degrees port. Altitude steady, contact in 30 seconds, one recalled. This orchestration was only possible because an industrial army thousands of miles away had provided endless machines. Without those crates of cathode ray tubes, there would be only guesswork and prayers. With them, the kamikaze attacks met walls of interceptors summoned with clinical precision. Every 250 words, another layer of the puzzle emerges. First, the mass production figures, then the factory floors. Next, the training schools. Together, they formed a chain that the Japanese could never sever. Courage could not outfly radar, and sacrifice could not outrun supply chains. For all the bravery displayed in cockpits, the war in the Pacific was tilting under the weight of America's industrial surge. And yet, behind the numbers, small human details persisted. In one California plant, a chaplain walked the aisles, offering cocoa to workers during night shifts. A technician recalled pausing with trembling hands after hearing news of kamikaze strikes, then returning to the soldering iron with renewed focus. Each act, humble as it seemed, echoed across the ocean. Without those hands, the glowing screens would have stayed dark. By early 1945, Japanese reconnaissance reports noted with alarm that enemy ships appear alerted at every bearing. What seemed supernatural was simply arithmetic, thousands of sets multiplied by thousands of trained men, supported by an industrial network that never slept. The skies of the Pacific had become transparent, and for pilots who depended on shadows, it was the end of hope. Factories had supplied not just machines, but inevitability. The question was no longer whether kamikazes could break through, but how many would perish before a handful found their mark. The cruel mathematics of production had turned valor into waste. And yet the story did not end in assembly halls or on glowing screens. Beyond the factories, on farms, in prisons, and across occupied islands, the human dimension of this transformation would reveal itself in unexpected ways. That next chapter would show how daily life bent under the weight of invisible eyes. In a prisoner-of-war camp near Guam, an American guard once overheard a captured Japanese pilot whisper to another, "They already know when we come, even before the clouds part." The statement was not defiance, but confusion, a weary confession of men who had seen their comrades vanish into the Pacific. For them, the mystery of radar was more than a military fact. It haunted their daily routines, shaping life behind barbed wire and in farm fields, where they were sometimes sent to labor. The POW camps themselves mirrored this uneasy intersection of humanity and technology. Records from the US Navy detail more than 19,000 Japanese aviators and sailors captured by late 1945. Some were housed in tents, straining against tropical rains, others in wooden barracks. Meals were monotonous: beans, bread, and occasional rice. Yet what struck many prisoners most was the radio room visible beyond the fences. They would watch guards carry in coils of wire and strange tubes, knowing that similar devices had guided fighters to intercept their squadrons. Life became a daily confrontation with the machines that had ended their missions. On the American side, routine grounded the extraordinary. Farmers in Kansas, for example, signed contracts to provide dried eggs and milk for radar outposts in the Pacific. Government tallies from 1944 note more than 100 million pounds of powdered eggs produced for field use. These rations fed not only soldiers, but also radar crews isolated for weeks on picket destroyers. The irony was sharp. The same breakfast powder eaten by a Midwestern child also sustained sailors staring at glowing screens that doomed kamikazes thousands of miles away. The sensory contrast was vivid. In Okinawan villages commandeered for airfields, children described the drone of American radars turning at night, the sweeping arms silhouetted against the stars. To them it was a haunting noise, like an iron heartbeat. Local farmers drafted for labor would deliver baskets of sweet potatoes to garrisons, hearing rumors that the steel ears could hear planes before the ears of men. Technology, once invisible, had entered the folklore of occupied life. Every 250 words, a crack in ideology widens. At first, Japanese propaganda promised that kamikazes would terrify Americans into retreat. But intercepted letters and prisoner diaries revealed the opposite. Doubt seeped in when attacks failed again and again. A captured pilot named Matsuo confessed during interrogation, "If the sky is already open to them, then our sacrifice means nothing." His words reveal the shattering of a creed that valor alone could win battles. Daily life in the camp, queuing for chow, mending uniforms, made this realization inescapable. Each failed sortie meant fewer familiar faces arriving at the barracks. Human beats emerge in these settings. At one Iowa prisoner farm, where 2,500 Japanese were sent to pick corn in autumn 1944, guards reported a strange moment. A prisoner paused, lifted a cob, and asked in halting English, "Does this go to the screens?" The guard did not answer, but the question lingered. In a world where food, labor, and industry all supported radar, even farming seemed linked to the unseen technology overhead. American servicemen, too, carried the burden. A chaplain aboard USS Bunker Hill recorded the faces of radar operators after long watches. They grow pale in the green glow, speaking little. They pray over cocoa more than sermons. Life aboard ship meant endless repetition, meals of beans and ham, salt air corroding uniforms, fatigue pressing in. Yet each blip on a screen carried weight. When a kamikaze was intercepted, the crew felt relief. When one slipped through, Guilt haunted the radar room. In this quiet space, humanity wrestled with responsibility. Contrast sharpened again in occupied Manila, where civilians scavenged wrecked Japanese aircraft. Children stripped aluminum skins to sell as scrap, while nearby American technicians erected radar masts with cranes. For locals, survival meant bread and coins. For Americans, survival meant circuits and vigilance. The two realities existed side by side, creating a tableau of poverty against industrial might. One Filipino farmer later recalled seeing both. "We had no rice, but they had towers that could see the sky." Numbers underscored these lived experiences. In 1945, U.S. records list more than 600 radar picket stations dotting the Pacific approaches to Okinawa. Each outpost required at least 150 sailors, all supplied by convoys carrying flour, tinned beef, and spare parts. That meant nearly 100,000 men whose lives depended on routine shipments of food and fuel, details invisible in grand strategy but central to survival. In contrast, Japanese diaries lamented shortages. One note from Kyushu described pilots drinking barley tea for energy before missions, a pitiful meal before certain death. For prisoners, ideology's cracks widened in unexpected ways. Some were shown radar screens during interrogations. A Navy report from Guam records the astonishment of a pilot who asked to touch the glass. When told the blip he saw was a friendly patrol returning, he whispered, "Then nothing is hidden." The effect was devastating. What had been propaganda slogans of divine wind collapsed into recognition of technological inevitability. Life in captivity forced them to face not just hunger, but also truth. Visualize the candid photograph. In a Midwestern farm field, Japanese POWs bend under the sun, pulling weeds. A U.S. guard leans on a fence, radio antenna behind him. Grainy silver film captures both weariness and wonder. This was the war behind the front lines, where technology shadowed even the simplest human labor. By summer 1945, the kamikaze program had consumed more than 4,000 young lives. Yet letters intercepted from pilots' families show growing despair. One mother wrote, "We send him to the sea, but the sea rejects him." Ordinary people grasped what commanders denied, that radar had stripped the tactic of its power. For civilians and captives alike, daily life became a slow reckoning with futility. Still, humanity endured. Guards sometimes shared cigarettes with prisoners. Farmers sent extra rations to radar crews. Sailors prayed in hushed tones over broken circuits. In these small acts, the brutality of strategy gave way to personal survival. Technology decided battles, but individuals bore the weight in sweat, hunger, and silence. As the war neared its climax, one truth became clear in diaries, farm contracts, and camp reports. The kamikaze dream was dying not in flames, but in the monotonous grind of daily life. Scarcity, labor, and screens had conspired to reveal the futility of sacrifice. Yet the final proof would not come in a camp or a factory, but in the largest battle the Pacific had ever seen, where entire waves of kamikazes hurled themselves against radar webs stretched across the horizon. That test was yet to come. On April 6, 1945, the horizon off Okinawa darkened with specks that multiplied until the sea itself seemed to boil with wings. More than 350 Japanese aircraft surged toward the American fleet in the single largest mass kamikaze strike of the war. To the aviators, it was to be a storm of steel and fire that would sweep the invaders from their doorstep. But below decks, sailors already tracked them as glowing arcs on radar screens. The ambush the pilots imagined was already undone before it began. Logs from Task Force 58 that day recorded the tempo with clinical precision. 30 hours, Picket destroyers detected inbound groups at ranges of 70 to 80 miles. By Aero 900, carrier-based Hellcats were airborne in squadrons of 12. Quartermaster tallies noted more than 1,500 intercept sorties launched in a single morning. The contrast was staggering. Each kamikaze sortie was a one-way flight, while American aircraft could be refueled, rearmed, and sent back up again and again. Industrial abundance translated directly into tactical resilience. The battle's sensory landscape was unforgettable. Sailors recalled the constant hum of radar sweeps, the shouted bearings echoing through steel passageways, and the rumble of engines overhead. On the waterline, destroyers bucked under the recoil of rapid-fire guns. Yet above it all, The calm cadence of radar operators provided the backbone. "Two groups 20 miles east, altitude low," one seaman repeated into a microphone. His words meant life or death. For Japanese pilots diving with prayers on their lips, there was only silence until tracers filled the sky. Numbers revealed the cost. Between April and June 1945, more than 500 kamikazes attacked U.S. forces at Okinawa. American records credit radar-directed defenses with destroying two-thirds before they reached striking distance. Still, 36 ships were sunk and nearly 400 damaged, with more than 4,900 Americans killed. The tragedy was immense. Yet without radar and the industrial network behind it, those figures would have multiplied many times over. The screens had not made men invulnerable, but they had made the difference between catastrophe and endurance. Archival images from Okinawa show the duality clearly. In one frame, a destroyer burns, black smoke curling skyward. In another, sailors sit in a darkened radar room, their faces lit by pale green glow, recording new tracks with pencils. Both belong to the same moment. Courage fought courage, but abundance bent the scale. The Japanese pilots gave everything, but the American fleet drew on factories, farms, and training schools that kept replenishing the shield. Even within Japan, awareness of futility spread. Civilian diaries from Kyushu record mothers hearing that planes fly but never return, while coastal fishermen reported watching radar masts sprout from American ships patrolling offshore. One note captured the despair. "They see us even in cloud and night." What spirit can hide from that? For a society taught that sacrifice could shift the balance, the recognition of technological inevitability was devastating. By war's end, statistics told the blunt truth. The United States had deployed more than 120,000 radar units across theaters, with factories producing an average of 1,500 sets each month in 1945. Japan, by contrast, fielded only a few thousand, many obsolete or starved of parts. The suicide tactic, once promised as decisive, was overwhelmed not by bravery, but by a quiet glow on countless screens. Kamikazes were doomed not by lack of will, but by the industrial arithmetic of modern war. And yet behind those numbers were human faces. Radar operators who went half-blind, staring at cathode ray tubes. Prisoners who asked if corn they picked became food for the screens. Mothers who soldered coils in Chicago and imagined protecting sons in the Pacific. Kamikaze letters folded with tears, confessing doubts no one dared speak aloud. History preserved both the triumph of technology and the sorrow of wasted sacrifice. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the legacy of radar was clear. It had not won battles alone, but it had multiplied American endurance. It transformed the Pacific from a battlefield of surprise to a theater of anticipation. The weapon was not just steel or fire, but time itself. Time to intercept, time to prepare, time to live. And that time was purchased on assembly lines, in training halls, and in the glow of silent screens. In the decades that followed, radar shaped both war and peace. Airports mounted towers to guide civilian flights. Weather stations used it to peer into storms. Fishermen tuned it to track shoals. What had once terrified pilots became a mundane part of daily life. Yet in the Pacific of 1944 and 1945, its meaning was stark. Courage alone could not overcome abundance. The kamikaze program became less a weapon than a tragedy, remembered for the lives it consumed rather than the ships it sank. Picture the final tableau. In August 1945, a radar room aboard USS Missouri sits quiet. Operators rest their heads on folded arms, screens still glowing though no enemy approaches. Outside, surrender documents wait to be signed. The war that began with surprise attacks has ended with detection so complete that nothing could remain hidden. The silence carries both relief and mourning. Epilogue. The Pacific War proved that valor without resources is sacrifice without result. Japan's kamikazes embodied devotion, but devotion could not outpace the multiplication of circuits and ships. The United States triumphed, not because its propaganda was louder, but because its factories were inexhaustible. Victory came from abundance, not illusion. And in that glow of radar screens, quiet, tireless, inevitable, the future of modern warfare was written.